Shajar al-Durr was not supposed to rule Egypt. She was a former slave, a woman in a world governed by military elites, and a name that history itself struggled to accept. And yet, in the 13th century, her authority was real. Coins were struck in her name, sermons proclaimed her rule. For a brief moment, she sat on Egypt's throne as sultan. She ruled during crisis, when the king was dead, when foreign armies threatened the state, and when Egypt stood on the edge of collapse. Her decisions held the country together at its most dangerous hour. But when the danger passed, the rules returned. Inside the palace she once commanded, Shajar al-Durr was stripped of power and put to death, not for failure, but for crossing a line that was never meant to be crossed. This is the story of Egypt's only female sultan, and by the end of this video, you'll understand not just how she rose and fell, but why history tried so hard to forget her. To understand how Shajar al-Durr arose, it is necessary to begin not with her as an individual, but with the system that produced her. 13th century Egypt was ruled not only by kings, but by institutions, by slavery, by military hierarchy, and by a court culture that transformed human beings into political assets. Within this world, power did not always belong to the freeborn. In rare cases, it was cultivated deliberately among the enslaved. The Mamluk system was unlike slavery as it is often imagined. Enslaved people, especially those selected for elite households, were not simply laborers, they were investments. Purchased young, educated rigorously, and trained to serve the state, they formed a class whose loyalty was expected to be absolute, precisely because their lives had been remade by the system itself. Male Mamluks were trained as soldiers and administrators. Female slaves within elite households were trained for the court. Language, etiquette, religious instruction, and political awareness were not optional skills, but necessities. Concubinage within royal households followed similar logic. These women were not chosen for affection alone. They were selected for intelligence, adaptability, and usefulness. A concubine who failed to understand court politics rarely survived long in relevance. A concubine who mastered it could become indispensable. It was into this system that Shajar al-Durr entered Egypt. Her origins before enslavement are unclear, and the historical record offers no romanticized beginnings. What matters more than where she came from is how quickly she adapted to the environment she entered. Within the Ayyubid court, survival depended on reading power accurately, knowing who mattered, when silence was safer than speech, and how influence moved without being announced. From the earliest references to her presence, Shajar al-Durr appears not as a passive figure, but as an observer. Literacy was not guaranteed among enslaved women, but those destined for royal service were educated, and Shajar al-Durr distinguished herself in this sphere. Court life required mastery of language, religious practice, and administrative awareness. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a political engine. Those who understood this gained leverage. Those who did not disappeared from record. Her association with Sultan al-Salih Ayyub did not elevate her overnight. At first, her position was conditional and fragile, as all such positions were. The court was crowded with rivals, alliances were unstable, and favor could be withdrawn as easily as it was granted. What separated Shajar al-Durr from others was consistency. She proved reliable in a world that valued predictability above affection. Over time, her role expanded beyond personal service. She became a trusted intermediary, someone who could convey messages, manage household affairs, and maintain continuity during the Sultan's frequent absences. This was not accidental. In medieval Islamic courts, proximity to the ruler translated into influence only if it was paired with competence. The sultan needed more than companionship. He needed someone who understood the machinery of rule. Shajar al-Durr learned that machinery well. As Sultan al-Salih Ayyub's reign became increasingly unstable, marked by illness, military pressure, and internal factionalism, the importance of capable inner court figures grew. The Sultan's health was fragile, and governance could not pause. Decisions still had to be made, correspondence still managed, and authority still projected outward. Those closest to him became extensions of his rule. Shajar al-Durr was among them. Her position evolved from concubine to confidant, and eventually to a role that blurred the boundaries between domestic management and political coordination. She was not issuing decrees publicly, but she was ensuring that orders were carried out. She was not negotiating treaties, but she was shaping access to the sultan. In a system where control over information often mattered more than formal titles, this was real power. Importantly, this ascent did not occur through rebellion or defiance of the system. Shajar al-Durr did not challenge the structure of slavery or concubinage. She mastered it. Her intelligence lay in recognizing the rules as they existed and excelling within them. The court rewarded usefulness, not ideology. She offered stability, discretion, and competence at a moment when all three were in short supply. Her elevation to queen through marriage to al-Salih Ayyub was therefore not a romantic culmination, but an institutional acknowledgement. Marriage in royal courts was a political act. It formalized an existing reliance. By the time she became Sultan's wife, Shajar al-Durr was already functioning as a central figure in the inner workings of the palace. This transition from property to partner did not erase her origins. The court did not forget that she had been enslaved, and neither did she. Her background likely sharpened her awareness of how quickly favor could turn into vulnerability. Unlike nobles born into security, she understood precarity intimately. That understanding would later shape her decisions in moments of crisis. As queen, her responsibilities expanded further. She oversaw palace administration, managed relationships with military elites, and acted as a stabilizing presence during the sultan's declining health. The distinction between public and private governance grew increasingly thin. When the sultan was absent or incapacitated, the palace continued to function because someone ensured it did. That someone was Shajar al-Durr. By this stage, her authority was not symbolic, it was practical. Officials recognized her influence even if they did not publicly acknowledge it. Messages passed through her. Decisions were delayed or accelerated based on her availability. The court had adapted around her presence. Yet this power remained unofficial and therefore precarious. She had no independent claim to authority. Everything she exercised was derived, first from proximity, then from trust. The system allowed this kind of influence, but only so long as it remained invisible. Visibility would later become dangerous. Still, during these years, Shajar al-Durr perfected a form of rule that depended on subtlety. She learned when to act and when to disappear. She learned how to maintain continuity without provoking resentment. Most importantly, she learned how fragile states actually were, how quickly they could unravel if key figures vanished. This knowledge would soon matter far more than titles. By the time Egypt approached one of the greatest crises in its history, Shajar al-Durr was no longer merely a figure within the court. She was part of the state's internal architecture. When others looked to the throne, they saw a sultan. When they looked behind it, they increasingly saw her. And when that sultan died, the question was no longer whether Shajar al-Durr was capable of holding power.
but whether Egypt could survive without her.
When we examine Shajar al-Durr's rise, it becomes clear that her greatest power was not in titles or public recognition, but in the quiet, almost invisible exercise of authority. This period, after Sultan al-Salih Ayyub fell ill and before she assumed formal power, is a case study in how influence can operate behind the scenes, in ways that are structurally essential to a state, yet historically difficult to trace. The illness of Sultan al-Salih was gradual but decisive. As the ruler's health waned, the court found itself navigating a delicate balance, maintaining continuity while preparing for an uncertain succession. Governance depended on the sultan's capacity to issue commands, yet his declining condition left a growing gap between intent and execution. In this vacuum, someone had to ensure that orders were conveyed, interpreted, and enacted faithfully. This was not a ceremonial task. It was the administrative spine of the kingdom, and Shajar al-Durr assumed it with meticulous care. Her authority at this time was not formal. She held no title, yet she became the critical link in the communication chain between the sultan and his ministers, generals, and provincial governors. In a system that relied heavily on trust and the proper execution of instructions, the ability to control the flow of information was a profound form of power. Letters and decrees did not simply travel, they had to be approved, sealed, and sent in accordance with established procedures. Mistakes could cause delays, misunderstandings, or worse, political collapse. Shajar al-Durr understood this implicitly. Seals, for example, were far more than decorative symbols. The Sultan's seal authenticated orders, gave them legal authority, and signified the weight of the throne behind them. Control over the seal was therefore equivalent to control over the machinery of governance. Historical records suggest that Shajar al-Durr not only safeguarded these objects, but also knew precisely when and how they should be applied. By managing seals and supervising messengers, she ensured that decrees were executed without compromising the Sultan's authority, even when he was too ill to intervene personally. Messengers, too, were instruments of power. In a time before instant communication, the speed and fidelity of a message could decide the outcome of a military campaign or the enforcement of tax collection. Shajar al-Durr's role involved coordinating these messengers, instructing them on nuances, clarifying ambiguous instructions, and sometimes altering the timing of messages to maintain political equilibrium. Her interventions were discreet but decisive. Each movement reinforced the perception that the Sultan's government remained stable, even when its leader could no longer actively command. Intermediaries in the palace and provincial administrations were another vector of influence. Courtiers, scribes, and governors relied on someone to interpret and relay the Sultan's will. Shajar al-Durr became that node. Through careful observation, she learned to anticipate resistance, identify allies, and navigate the rigid hierarchies of the court. When officials hesitated or questioned orders, she leveraged her understanding of protocol, relationships, and the broader strategic context to ensure compliance. Her authority was practiced in the spaces between command and action, invisible to those outside the palace, yet vital to the state's survival. Early resistance from court officials was inevitable. Even in societies where women occasionally exercised influence, the norms of 13th century Egypt were clear. Formal governance belonged to men, particularly the military elite and landed aristocracy. Shajar al-Durr challenged these expectations, though she never did so overtly. Rather than issuing commands publicly, she guided the wheels of government behind a veil of procedural fidelity. Officials were sometimes frustrated or suspicious, but she consistently operated within the accepted frameworks of loyalty and protocol. In this way, she exercised real power while avoiding open confrontation. The palace itself became a physical anchor for her authority. Gates, chambers, and corridors functioned as both barriers and instruments. By controlling who could access certain spaces and when, she indirectly influenced the flow of information and the execution of policy. Historical sources note that proximity to the Sultan, once a privilege, was mediated increasingly through her presence. Courtiers learned that petitions, requests, or interventions required her approval, or at least her mediation. By mastering the spatial politics of the palace, she amplified her power without ever holding the title of ruler. This period also demonstrates a broader principle. Legitimacy often precedes declaration. Shajar al-Durr's influence rested on the careful performance of duties associated with authority before she was formally recognized as sultan. By the time her name would appear on coins or in sermons, she had already exercised the essential functions of governance for months, if not years. The court and the military had come to rely on her decisiveness and discretion, which created a practical legitimacy even when formal acknowledgement was delayed. In a sense, Shajar al-Durr's power behind the veil was a rehearsal for formal rule. Every letter she signed, every order she supervised, every intermediary she guided was part of a continuous demonstration of capability. These acts were invisible to the public, yet they were the scaffolding that would allow her to assume the throne after the death of the Sultan. Without this careful, methodical accumulation of authority, her later claim to the throne could not have succeeded. Her role was not merely administrative, it required strategic judgment. In cases where military leaders debated tactics or provincial governors delayed tax payments, she mediated disputes, interpreted the sultan's preferences, and sometimes made judgment calls that would have been considered the prerogative of the ruler himself. By doing so, she created a quiet dependence. The system began to function not despite her, but because of her interventions. Importantly, Shajar al-Durr's exercise of power relied on invisible structures and symbols rather than brute force or open command. Seals, letters, and palace procedures were instruments she mastered. These were not ornamental or trivial, they were the medium through which legitimacy was both practiced and recognized. In other words, authority is as much a process as it is a position. Shajar al-Durr understood this principle instinctively, long before she would claim the throne openly. Her mastery of these invisible mechanisms also illuminates why some officials were wary of her influence. Her authority was decentralized yet comprehensive, embedded in procedure, embedded in expectation, embedded in the habits of those around her. Even without a crown, she could shape outcomes. To those unfamiliar with the subtleties of court administration, her power must have seemed anomalous, yet it was grounded entirely in institutional practice. This period of secret governance highlights a broader lesson about historical power. It is often exercised quietly, through structures, objects, and protocols that appear mundane to the untrained eye. Shajar al-Durr's example illustrates that the capacity to govern is not defined solely by public titles, military command, or popular acclaim. It can be exercised in the shadows of ceremony, in the management of objects and information, and in the careful orchestration of human behavior. By the time Sultan al-Salih passed away, Shajar al-Durr had already become indispensable. Her authority was embedded in the operations of the state. Officials knew that the machinery of governance would stall without her oversight. Courtiers understood that communication lines, decree enforcement, and palace operations flowed through her hands. The public may not have recognized her influence, but within the palace walls, she was already functioning as de facto ruler. This phase of her life also underscores the calculated patience required to convert influence into formal authority. Shajar al-Durr did not seek titles prematurely. She did not confront established hierarchies openly. Instead, she practiced legitimacy, demonstrating capability, reliability, and strategic acumen in ways that could not be ignored. When the time came for her formal assumption of power, her authority was already institutionalized, not merely ceremonial. In summary, Shajar al-Durr's years behind the veil reveal a form of power rarely recorded in traditional histories. It is a power exercised through process, objects, and intermediaries, through seals, letters, palace gates, and procedural expertise. It is a power that relies on observation, mediation, and careful timing. And it is a power that demonstrates a fundamental truth about governance.
Legitimacy is earned through the exercise of authority, often long before it is recognized publicly. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that Shajar al-Durr's eventual reign as sultan was not sudden, accidental, or unearned. It was the culmination of months, possibly years, of invisible labor, of managing a state in crisis, exercising judgment behind the veil, and building reliance among those whose compliance mattered most. Without this phase, her later claim to the throne could not have succeeded. Next, we will explore the crisis that would force Shajar al-Durr out from behind the veil and onto the throne itself, a moment when Egypt's survival depended not just on her competence, but on her willingness to act decisively in ways history would never forget.
Shajar al-Durr's transition from power behind the veil to openly governing Egypt did not occur in calm circumstances. It came during one of the greatest external threats the kingdom had ever faced, the Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France. In the mid-13th century, Egypt was not merely a kingdom, it was a crossroads of political, military, and economic currents that shaped the entire region. To maintain authority in such a landscape required not only courage, but precision, timing, and the ability to manipulate perception. The Crusaders advanced along the Nile, their fleets and armies threatening the very heart of Egypt. Cities that had been secure for decades were suddenly vulnerable. The Sultan at the time, Al-Salih Ayyub, faced the dual challenge of organizing a defense and ensuring continuity of governance. He had led Egypt's forces in the past, but now his health, already fragile, became an acute liability. Within this context, Shajar al-Durr's role shifted from managing palace communications to orchestrating the kingdom's response under extreme uncertainty. The crisis escalated dramatically when Sultan al-Salih died unexpectedly during the campaign. Officially, his death was a private matter. Publicly acknowledging it in the midst of a foreign invasion would have threatened both morale and operational effectiveness. In this moment, the kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. Leadership was essential, but the throne appeared temporarily vacant. It was a scenario that could have plunged Egypt into both military and political disaster. Shajar al-Durr made a decision that would define her historical significance. She concealed the Sultan's death. This was not an act of impulse or ambition, it was a calculated intervention to maintain stability and prevent a collapse of command. By hiding the Sultan's death, she ensured that generals, provincial governors, and soldiers continued to follow the established chain of authority. Egypt's response to the Crusader threat would remain coordinated, avoiding confusion that could have led to catastrophic defeats. Concealing the Sultan's death required rigorous control over information. Messengers were instructed carefully, and written communications were managed to project continuity. Couriers carried letters signed with the Sultan's seal, ensuring that orders appeared authoritative and genuine. Shajar al-Durr coordinated these movements with precision, aware that any slip could expose the truth and trigger unrest. Timing was critical. Missteps in communication could provoke panic among troops or embolden enemy forces. While the deception was underway, Shajar al-Durr also engaged in what can only be described as crisis management on a national scale. She liaised with generals who had never taken orders from her publicly, guiding them in troop movements, supply allocation, and defensive strategies. Every instruction she issued was framed as originating from the Sultan, preserving the illusion of leadership while she orchestrated decision-making from behind the scenes. Historical accounts suggest that her interventions were discreet yet decisive. They allowed Egypt to maintain cohesion under circumstances that could have shattered lesser administrations. The challenge of controlling both perception and action in this crisis cannot be overstated. Egyptian forces faced not only a powerful external enemy, but also the potential for internal dissent. In the absence of visible leadership, rival factions within the military or the court might have attempted to seize authority.
Shajar al-Durr's careful manipulation of information prevented such power grabs. She understood that the success of military operations depended as much on belief in leadership as on strategic competence. By maintaining the appearance of continuity, she ensured operational focus while minimizing political instability. This period of statecraft demonstrates the critical interplay of timing, deception, and communication. Shajar al-Durr's approach was methodical. Orders were conveyed on schedule, messages confirmed, and responses monitored. Couriers were sent with clear instructions, and intermediaries were briefed on potential contingencies. Every action was calculated to reinforce confidence in the Sultan's ongoing command, even though he was no longer alive. Egypt's victory over the Crusaders would depend on this careful orchestration as much as on the battlefield tactics of its generals. The culmination of these efforts came when Egyptian forces confronted the Crusader army near Mansoura. The defense was coordinated, disciplined, and adaptive. The Sultan's absence was invisible to the soldiers thanks to Shajar al-Durr's management of information and command lines. The Egyptians successfully resisted the invasion, capturing key Crusader leaders and forcing a retreat. The military victory was remarkable not only for its strategic significance, but also because it was achieved under the shadow of a concealed leadership vacuum. Yet the battle was only part of the story. The victory created a political vacuum. With the Sultan deceased and no immediate heir recognized publicly, Egypt required a legitimate ruler to formalize governance and stabilize the state. The very system that had allowed Shajar al-Durr to operate effectively behind the veil now demanded that her authority be acknowledged openly. Without a sultan, the mechanisms of taxation, diplomacy, and administration faced potential paralysis. In response, Shajar al-Durr took decisive steps to transition from de facto administrator to formal authority. She presented herself not as a usurper, but as a continuation of the state's existing order. Her prior experience managing the Sultan's communications, her relationships with military leaders, and her demonstrated competence gave her credibility that no other figure at the court could match. In essence, her assumption of power was an extension of previously established authority, legitimized by necessity and demonstrated skill. Throughout this crisis, her actions were not driven by personal ambition or emotional reaction, but by the practical requirements of governance. She understood that in moments of extreme danger, leadership is as much about perception as it is about decision-making. By maintaining the illusion of continuity, she preserved morale, directed military operations, and ensured that Egypt could withstand a foreign threat. In doing so, she set the stage for her unprecedented rise to the throne. The events of this period also highlight a crucial historical principle. Power is often claimed in moments of crisis. For Shajar al-Durr, the Seventh Crusade provided both the necessity and the opportunity for public authority. Her ability to act decisively during uncertainty transformed invisible influence into recognized rule. Without the combination of the Sultan's death, the external threat, and her methodical management of information, her path to the throne would have been far more perilous, if not impossible. By the end of this period, Shajar al-Durr had achieved a rare feat. She saved Egypt from foreign invasion, maintained the functioning of its administrative apparatus, and created the conditions for her own formal recognition. Her rise was not theatrical, it was strategic. Every decision was grounded in an understanding of institutional dynamics, human behavior, and the imperatives of timing. She demonstrated that statecraft is not only about issuing orders, but about sustaining the confidence of those who execute them, even under extraordinary circumstances. The Seventh Crusade thus became the defining backdrop for her transition from palace intermediary to sultan. In hiding the Sultan's death, coordinating generals, and preserving the illusion of leadership, Shajar al-Durr executed one of the most sophisticated exercises of political authority in medieval Egyptian history. Her actions during this crisis reveal a ruler who understood that governance is both procedural and performative, requiring not just decisions but the careful management of perception. With the foreign threat resolved and the Sultan gone, Egypt now faced a new dilemma. The throne was vacant, legitimacy was in question, and the kingdom required a sovereign. Shajar al-Durr would step forward to become Egypt's only female sultan, a moment that would challenge tradition, unsettle elites, and redefine the possibilities of power in the medieval Islamic world.
The moment Shajar al-Durr stepped out from the shadows of palace authority and claimed the throne formally was unprecedented. Egypt, a kingdom shaped by centuries of male-dominated rule, suddenly had a woman as sultan, not merely a figurehead, but the recognized sovereign. The mechanisms of legitimacy she employed were subtle, symbolic, and deeply rooted in the medieval Islamic state. To understand her reign, one must first understand the power of symbols, coins, sermons, and public titles, and why these mattered far more than military victories or courtly maneuvering. The formal declaration of Shajar al-Durr as sultan was a calculated act. Unlike ceremonial proclamations today, medieval authority required the public affirmation of multiple societal pillars. Recognition by the military elite, religious authorities, and administrative officers was essential. Without their acknowledgement, her rule could have remained nominal, or worse, challenged violently. Shajar al-Durr's elevation did not depend on her personal charisma. It relied on institutional validation expressed through enduring symbols of authority. Coins minted in her name were among the most potent of these symbols. In medieval Egypt, currency was far more than an economic instrument. It was a proclamation of sovereignty. Coins bore inscriptions affirming the ruler's legitimacy and circulated throughout the kingdom, reaching towns, villages, and distant provinces. Each coin in circulation was a reminder that Egypt had a sultan and that the state's authority was recognized publicly. By striking coins with her name, Shajar al-Durr effectively embedded her rule into the daily lives of the population, transforming an abstract concept, legitimacy, into a tangible, observable fact. The khutbah, or sermon, was equally significant. Delivered in mosques during Friday prayers, it was a ritualized acknowledgement of authority. To have a ruler's name proclaimed in the khutbah was to have their sovereignty validated before the public, sanctioned by religious ritual. For a woman, this was an extraordinary achievement. Shajar al-Durr's name in the sermon signified not only her political authority, but her recognition within the framework of Islamic legitimacy. Every congregation that heard her name spoken in prayer encountered the message. She was the sultan, and her authority was sanctioned by tradition and faith. Together, coins and sermons communicated legitimacy in a way that armies could not. Military victories demonstrate strength, but they do not inherently confer the right to rule. Symbols, rituals, and administrative acts create the perception of legitimacy, which in turn stabilizes society and consolidates power. Shajar al-Durr understood this principle. By securing recognition through these channels, she ensured that her rule would be seen as proper, necessary, and continuous with the expectations of the medieval state. Her unprecedented position did, however, provoke tension. Religious scholars and officials were confronted with a challenge to centuries of established norms. The notion of a female sultan strained traditional interpretations of leadership, even though Islam itself did not explicitly forbid women from assuming authority. The objection was not theological alone, but social. Her reign unsettled the expectations of elites who were accustomed to exercising influence over male rulers who assumed female figures would remain secondary. The khutbahs that once legitimized male sultans now publicly acknowledged her as sovereign, creating both symbolic and practical unease among the religious and political establishment.
Political elites responded cautiously, some with outright resistance. The Mamluk generals, court officials, and provincial administrators recognized the unprecedented nature of her rule. Their unease was not born of irrationality, but of precedent. Medieval governance depended on predictable hierarchies. A woman on the throne disrupted those expectations, creating uncertainty about loyalty, succession, and the interpretation of law. Shajar al-Durr's authority was now formal, yet its novelty generated anxiety. Would tradition enforce her limits, or could she navigate and redefine them? Her reign also required careful management of these tensions. Shajar al-Durr's authority depended on symbolic reinforcement at multiple levels. Beyond coins and sermons, her name appeared in official correspondence and legal documents. Administrative orders carried her seal. Even minor ceremonial acts, from receiving foreign emissaries to managing palace protocols, communicated continuity and legitimacy. By anchoring her authority in ritual, currency, and law, she reduced the potential for challenges based on precedent alone. It is critical to recognize that her consolidation of power was not achieved by military force. The armies that had defended Egypt against the Crusaders were loyal to the Sultanate, not her personally. She relied instead on the formal instruments of governance to assert authority. By demonstrating competence, issuing official decrees, and controlling recognition channels, she transformed what might have been perceived as a temporary anomaly into an established rule. Coins, in particular, played a role beyond symbolism. They circulated widely, reaching populations far removed from the court. Villagers, merchants, and provincial officials could see tangible proof of her rule. A coin with her name affirmed both the Sultanate's continuity and her authority. Similarly, the khutbah publicly communicated legitimacy to citizens and religious scholars alike, signaling that the spiritual framework endorsed her sovereignty. These instruments functioned as a network of recognition that extended across the kingdom, anchoring her authority in both public and institutional consciousness. Yet, despite these reinforcements, the novelty of a female sultan created vulnerability. Elites who were uncomfortable with her rule began to test boundaries. Courtiers watched for mistakes, military commanders hesitated in obedience, and religious authorities debated interpretations of propriety and precedent. Shajar al-Durr's challenge was to exercise power while maintaining stability, demonstrating that her authority could coexist with the structures and traditions that had long defined Egypt. Her actions in this period highlight an important principle of governance. Legitimacy often resides in perception as much as law or force. By ensuring her recognition through coins, sermons, and official titles, Shajar al-Durr built a foundation that made her rule difficult to ignore, challenge, or overturn, even as it unsettled traditional assumptions about who could occupy the throne. Historical accounts from the period record both admiration and unease. Some chroniclers praised her decisiveness and competence, while others emphasized the unprecedented nature of a woman exercising such authority. The tension between recognition and resistance defined her early reign. She had power, but it had to be continuously reinforced through ritual, administrative practice, and symbolic gestures. The balance of authority and perception became the axis upon which her rule turned. By the end of this phase, Shajar al-Durr had established a tangible, institutionalized presence in Egypt. She had moved from invisible power behind the veil to a publicly recognized sultan, validated by the essential instruments of legitimacy: coins bearing her name, sermons proclaiming her authority, and formal acknowledgement in administrative documents. Each act reinforced the others, creating a network of recognition that made her position enduring, at least in theory. This period also underscores the historical context of her achievements. Her rule was legitimate not because it conformed to modern ideas of gender equality, but because she mastered the mechanisms through which authority was recognized in 13th century Egypt. By operating within these systems, she secured recognition in a society structured to resist female rulership. The fear she inspired among elites was not personal, it was structural. Her presence challenged assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and precedent, forcing the kingdom to accommodate a ruler it had never seen before. Shajar al-Durr's reign as Egypt's only female sultan demonstrates how authority can be constructed through symbols and recognition rather than force alone. Coins, sermons, and titles were not mere formalities. They were instruments of survival and consolidation. Through them, she navigated a fragile political environment, earned acknowledgement from key power holders, and established her legitimacy in a society that had no precedent for a woman occupying the throne. Despite her carefully constructed authority, Shajar al-Durr's position remained precarious. Recognition could be withdrawn, alliances could shift, and rivals could emerge. In the next phase of her story, we will explore marriage, betrayal, and political isolation, showing how even the most meticulously validated authority can be undermined by the very system it relies on.
By the time Shajar al-Durr had formally claimed the sultanate, her authority was visible, recognized, and unprecedented. Yet legitimacy in a medieval kingdom was never simply a matter of ritual or symbols. Political power was inseparable from social and structural norms, and in 13th century Egypt, a woman holding the throne represented both an anomaly and a threat to established hierarchies. This is where marriage became not a personal matter, but a strategic instrument, a mechanism through which society attempted to normalize her rule and contain her influence. From the perspective of court politics, Shajar al-Durr's reign challenged centuries of expectation. Elites who had previously exercised indirect authority over male sultans now faced the reality of a woman in direct command. Military commanders, bureaucrats, and religious scholars were forced to recalibrate their loyalties. While many acknowledged her competence, the structural discomfort of her position required remedies beyond recognition. Marriage, in this context, served as a tool to reinforce traditional expectations while maintaining continuity of governance. Pressure quickly mounted for her to marry. Marriage was the conventional way to legitimize a female ruler by aligning her authority with that of a male partner who could publicly embody power. The act was not about partnership or affection, it was about containment, integration, and political reassurance. For Shajar al-Durr, the decision was strategic. Accepting a marital alliance allowed her to retain practical influence while mitigating the risk of overt resistance from elites who might otherwise question her rule. Her choice of spouse fell upon Aibak, a prominent Mamluk commander. This alliance was deliberate. Aibak commanded loyalty from segments of the military, had established relationships with bureaucrats, and carried a reputation that reinforced legitimacy in the eyes of the court. By marrying him, Shajar al-Durr both solidified her rule and addressed the anxieties of those who feared instability. Yet the marriage itself was not the consolidation of power, it was a political instrument intended to stabilize her position within a structurally constrained environment. Even after marriage, Shajar al-Durr's authority faced challenges. Her sovereignty had been recognized symbolically and procedurally, but the introduction of a male co-ruler shifted the dynamics of power. Where she had once exercised authority with minimal resistance, she now had to navigate competing interests, mediating between her own objectives and the expectations of her spouse, the military elite, and court officials. Authority became shared, and in a system designed for male succession, her leverage began to diminish. Political isolation intensified as alliances within the palace shifted. Courtiers and officials who had previously deferred to her guidance recalibrated their loyalties, often privileging Aibak's emerging authority. The networks of dependence that had once bolstered her influence, the control of communication, intermediaries, and information, now had to accommodate additional actors. Her previous advantage as the indispensable arbiter behind the veil was partially eroded by the presence of a male co-ruler whose legitimacy was socially unquestioned. Betrayals within the palace were structural rather than personal. Historical records indicate that those closest to her, bound by both loyalty and obligation, occasionally aligned with other centers of power when it served institutional interests. Loyalty in the medieval court was conditional, often contingent upon perceptions of strength, stability, and conformity with expected norms. Shajar al-Durr's gender, while irrelevant to her competence, made her position inherently fragile within these structural expectations.
When allies recalibrated their loyalty to Ibeck or other male figures, it was not necessarily an act of malice, it was a reflection of how hierarchies functioned to preserve social continuity. As her influence eroded, Shajar al-Durr faced a new set of challenges. Decision-making required negotiation, persuasion, and the careful balancing of competing interests. Actions that had once been executed with unilateral authority now had to account for the ambitions, expectations, and reactions of others within the court. Administrative continuity remained her responsibility, but her leverage over personnel and policy was increasingly constrained. Every decree, every instruction was subject to the tacit approval of networks she had once controlled outright. Marriage to Ibeck also introduced tensions in military and administrative domains. Commanders accustomed to acting under her direct guidance now had divided loyalties. Provincial officials and governors assessed the balance of power carefully, adjusting their compliance based on the perceived locus of authority. Even the symbolic instruments of legitimacy, coins, seals, and official correspondence, were now co-branded, subtly shifting recognition from her alone to a shared authority. While this stabilized her public position, it also diminished the unique structural dominance she had previously exercised. Despite these constraints, Shajar al-Durr continued to demonstrate political acumen. She navigated palace intrigue, negotiated between factions, and maintained as much influence as the structure permitted. Her experience behind the veil had prepared her for such complex negotiation, teaching her that authority was not only about visible recognition, but about managing perception, maintaining networks, and strategically exercising leverage where it remained effective. Yet the erosion of her autonomous authority was an inevitable consequence of the court's reliance on male-centered hierarchies, a structural reality, not a personal betrayal. Throughout this period, the palace became a site of delicate tension. Each alliance, each decree, each ceremonial act was mediated by the interplay of formal authority, informal influence, and structural expectation. Shajar al-Durr's ability to exercise independent judgment was constrained, yet she retained the capacity to shape outcomes in subtle ways. These interventions, however, were increasingly limited by the very system that had initially allowed her to rise. Power, once extraordinary and concentrated, now existed in a network she had to navigate carefully. The narrative of her isolation is also a lesson in institutional misogyny, not personal animosity. Structures of power in medieval Egypt were designed for male succession and leadership. Women who stepped outside these norms, no matter their competence, were always at risk of marginalization. Shajar al-Durr's experience demonstrates how exceptional capability can coexist with structural vulnerability. She retained influence, but the mechanisms that once supported her independent authority were increasingly aligned to contain it. Historical accounts suggest that betrayals were often subtle: delayed obedience, cautious implementation of orders, or quiet alignment with other figures of authority. These actions were consistent with the institutional logic of the court. Officials acted not from personal vendetta, but according to expectations of hierarchy and precedent. Shajar al-Durr's situation highlights how political systems can constrain even the most capable actors when those actors defy social norms. Despite these challenges, Shajar al-Durr's continued influence reflected her skill and adaptability. She maintained critical administrative functions, managed communications, and ensured that the machinery of the state did not collapse. While her public authority was partially circumscribed, her experience and strategic insight allowed her to remain an indispensable figure within the palace. The erosion of her power was gradual, highlighting how structural constraints, rather than sudden betrayal, can reshape authority over time. By the end of this phase, Shajar al-Durr had transitioned from a figure of unprecedented independent authority to a ruler whose power required negotiation, mediation, and constant awareness of the structures around her. Marriage, while politically necessary, introduced both stabilization and containment, illustrating the dual nature of alliances in maintaining legitimacy. Her experience demonstrates that authority is never absolute, and that even symbols of sovereignty, titles, coins, khutbahs, cannot fully insulate a ruler from structural pressures. The final chapter of her story would bring these pressures to a head. Political isolation, structural containment, and the fragility of legitimacy combined to make her vulnerable in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. In the next section, we will examine her murder and the historical attempt to erase her reign, revealing how even a capable ruler can fall when institutions, tradition, and ambition converge.
The story of Shajar al-Durr reaches its tragic and instructive conclusion not in the sweep of armies or the issuance of decrees, but in the deliberate orchestration of her removal from power and from memory. Her murder was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated assertion of authority, a signal to contemporaries and to posterity that some forms of power were forbidden and that those who transgressed social and structural norms would be punished in ways that transcended their life. Shajar al-Durr's final betrayal was the product of structural pressures and elite anxieties rather than personal enmity alone. Those who had previously tolerated or even depended upon her authority now sought to reassert a system in which male dominance was the uncontested norm. Her marriage to Ibok had partially contained her authority, but it also introduced new dynamics. Political allies now had alternative centers of power to support, while factions within the court anticipated her gradual decline. In such an environment, the timing and execution of her removal were as strategic as her rise had been. Her death was public, and its symbolism was meticulously constructed. It was not an act of spontaneous violence, but a deliberate demonstration to the court, military, and citizenry. In medieval political culture, public punishment served to communicate societal boundaries, the limits of acceptable behavior, the consequences of defiance, and the reinforcement of hierarchical order. Shajar al-Durr's execution made a statement far beyond the act itself. It signaled that the throne, even in a time of crisis, was expected to conform to the conventions of gender, lineage, and elite control. Historical sources describe the ritualized nature of the punishment without dwelling on gore. Chroniclers emphasized her removal from the throne, the formal acknowledgement of her deposition, and the desecration of objects associated with her authority, rather than focusing on personal suffering. Coins bearing her image were recalled, sermons ceased to mention her name, and records began to obscure her role. These acts were deliberate attempts to erase legitimacy retroactively, ensuring that her reign could not serve as precedent or inspiration. Desecration of her symbols was as meaningful as any physical act. By removing her name from public rituals, recalling minted currency, and controlling narrative accounts, her successors communicated that her authority had been exceptional, unauthorized, and ultimately illegitimate. This is a key lesson in medieval governance. Authority is validated not only in life, but also in how history is allowed to remember or forget it. Shajar al-Durr's murder, then, was both an immediate political act and a long-term mechanism of historical control. Chroniclers of the period often displayed discomfort with her reign. Some acknowledged her competence and even celebrated her role in the defense of Egypt, yet their narratives were careful to frame her accomplishments as anomalies, often attributing successes to male generals, advisors, or the broader machinery of the Sultanate. By doing so, they minimized the perception of a woman exercising sovereign authority. These textual interventions were subtle but effective. They ensured that future readers would encounter Shajar al-Durr as a footnote or exception rather than as a central figure in Egypt's history. The attempt to delegitimize her reign extended beyond chronicles. Legal and administrative records were altered to reflect continuity under male rulers, as if her tenure were an interruption rather than a legitimate period of governance. Historians writing decades later echoed these patterns, framing her as a cautionary example rather than as a competent ruler whose authority had once been real. In essence, her punishment was encoded into history itself. This symbolic aspect of her death is central to understanding its meaning. Medieval political culture relied heavily on visual, procedural, and narrative cues to communicate authority. Public punishment, removal from ritual recognition, and the rewriting of administrative memory were all methods to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable power. Shajar al-Durr's murder and posthumous treatment were less about personal vengeance than about preserving the norms of the system she had temporarily upended.
Her life and death together illustrate the precarious nature of exceptional authority. While she demonstrated skill, judgment, and decisiveness, the structural realities of medieval Egypt ultimately constrained her. Her murder functioned as a warning encoded into both the social and historical fabric. Extraordinary power may be achievable, but it is also highly surveilled, regulated, and, if necessary, erased. Even centuries later, the shadow of her rule remains faint. Coins, khutbahs, and administrative acts survive in fragmentary form, yet her narrative is often subordinated to those of male rulers who succeeded her. This selective memory is itself a continuation of the symbolic punishment. By controlling recognition after death, the system reinforced the very norms that had limited her in life. Her erasure underscores an enduring question for historians and observers alike. How many rulers are remembered for what they accomplished, and how many are deliberately forgotten? In reflecting on Shajar al-Durr's life, the lesson is both stark and measured. Exceptional capability can be constrained by structural forces. Visibility and legitimacy are inseparable from context, and power, once exercised, can be recalibrated not only through immediate political action, but also through historical narrative itself. Her murder was not simply an act of elimination. It was a signal to contemporaries and to posterity that the boundaries of authority are socially enforced and that deviation carries consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime. This historical episode invites broader reflection. In examining rulers who are remembered versus those who are erased, we confront the mechanisms through which societies encode warnings, values, and limitations into memory. Shajar al-Durr's erasure was methodical, coins recalled, sermons silenced, chronicles reshaped. Yet her story survives precisely because the tension between competence, gender, and structural constraint remains compelling. It raises the question of who is permitted to wield authority and who is written out of the record for doing so. Ultimately, the story of Shajar al-Durr is not simply about the fall of a female sultan. It is about the interplay between exceptional ability and structural limits, the ways in which power is recognized, contested, and ultimately remembered or forgotten. Her murder and the subsequent manipulation of historical memory serve as both a warning and a reflection of the social logic of medieval Egypt. The very system she had preserved through skill and decisiveness moved to erase her when she transgressed boundaries that society was not ready to acknowledge. Shajar al-Durr's life challenges us to consider the fragility of authority, the complexity of legitimacy, and the invisible power of narrative. She rose from obscurity to sovereignty, navigated crises that could have destroyed the kingdom, and yet was removed in a manner designed to erase her existence from public memory. Her story asks us how many rulers are remembered and how many are deliberately forgotten.